Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Please do put in the chat where you're dialing in from, and I hope it's not as wet and windy as it is here in Bristol. We'll get cracking in a couple of minutes when we've got a few more people joining. But for now, it'd be good to hear where you're calling from.
Oh, Wimbledon, that's a win, I think. Although no tennis today.
I hear Seattle is quite rainy a lot of the time, so no surprises there.
Sunny Germany today, but stormy.
So we've got a good spread of people. I might make a start then and move into the scripted part of things, tell you a bit about what's going on. So yes, thank you everyone for joining. Good afternoon and welcome to this Ask the Analyst session for the 2023 Fosway 9 Grid for Cloud HR. I'm John Kennard, Content Editor at Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst, and I'll be your host for today's session. So Fosway Group, we founded in 1996. We provide in-depth corporate research on next-gen HR talent and learning, as well as analyst and advisory services to more than 3,000 European and international multinationals and corporates. Our latest analysis of the cloud-based HR systems market reveals an environment that is responding well to the challenges of social, business, and digital transformation with a widespread embrace of cloud-based HR solutions. While there are a handful of specialists new to the 9 Grid in this cycle, it still seems that the suites are the ones that are benefiting most from a market that remains under pressure to consolidate, but we'll get into this a bit later. But it gives me great pleasure to welcome lead analyst on this research, Sven Elbert, as well as Fosway CEO and founder, David Wilson, to dissect, discuss, and ruminate on all the findings in this latest iteration of the 9 Grid for Cloud HR. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. We will have a lengthy Q&A session at the end. Feel free to ask questions as we go along, and I'll ask them there and then if it makes sense, or I will gather them up for the Q&A session at the end. So please do click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen, post your questions there, send to everyone, make sure you do that. Play nicely, as we always say, this is a conversation. So to get into it, before we come to Sven with a bit more of the specifics, it would be great to introduce David Wilson and to set the scene by giving us all a bit of an explanation about the provenance of the 9 Grid and its methodology. David, it's over to you.
And good afternoon from me for everybody. And apologies if you've seen multiple ones of these before. So the next few slides you'll be very familiar with, but I think for anybody that's new to these sessions, it's really useful to just have a bit of context behind where the 9 Grids come from and the process behind them. We've been working on 9 Grid or publicly as a model now for more than 10 years, and associated with the different segments we do. Each process seems to get bigger, more complicated, more data points, more inputs than ever before. And to be honest, each one is a real monster in terms of the research effort that goes into it. So well done to Sven, obviously, for leading that for Cloud HR, which is obviously one of our bigger ones as well. The context really is to understand is, where do we get the input from? And it's very, very multiplicity of sources, but obviously our primary focus is already understanding the view from the corporate side of the audience in terms of really, what are their experiences with different solutions? What are they looking at? What are they considering doing in the future, and so on? So, from our corporate research network and corporate membership, through private work that we do with organizations, of course, and corporate inquiry work, which is obviously a source of much more detailed insight as well, through public research processes, and survey stuff, including our HR realities research and so on. And then on top of that, we have a whole vendor process, including vendor briefings, structured data capture, sending them all nice long spreadsheets to fill in to understand what their capability sets are around things, briefings, demonstrations, and so on, customer referencing process off the back end of that, plus industry events and meetings. And some of you may be aware, obviously, we were at Unleash a couple of weeks ago, and HR Tech in the States just before that as well. So there's a massive process that happens around each one. The important thing to understand in some ways is, who gets on the 9 grids as well, because what we've always really tried to focus on is understanding the options that are relevant to our primary reader audience, which, as I said, is corporate, typically EMEA headquartered, multinational companies, those kinds of organizations. So who are the vendors that are actively in use within those organizations, particularly within our corporate research network, so the larger organizations that we've engaged with on a more frequent basis. And in some of those, they'll be using multiple solutions in different parts of their business. So who are they actively using? Who's actively in consideration? So in other words, when they're looking at change processes and replacement, who are they considering? Who are they looking at? And then the final piece is, obviously, we're also trying to track innovator companies that typically have that potential to achieve 1 or 2. In other words, the potential to become in active use in that population. And that's obviously where it's really important for us in terms of tracking innovation in the market, and maybe the companies that are going to be acquired in some cases by some of those bigger strategic vendors as well. The key thing also is you can't, from a vendor, they can't buy their way onto a 9 grid. It's based on merit of inclusion, is based on relevance to the audience. You can't buy your way on it, but also a vendor can't buy their way off it. They can't, they can't decline to be involved in the 9 grid process. It's based on who's relevant to our reader audience. And as I said, there's this huge list of things and different sources we come from. I think the important thing is to say, to emphasize, is that the primary point of view, the most important view for us, is what comes from the customer, as opposed to what the vendors say about themselves. Ultimately is to understand, what their customers think of them. And that's why that, who are you using, who are you considering, why are you doing that, why have you replaced something, etc. That part of the narrative is really, really important. But in summary, we have thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lines of functional data, of customer insight, of whatever else. And what we're trying to then do is distill that together in the best view that we can, based on the current criteria in the market. The final bit I'm going to basically emphasize again is read the report. So effectively, a lot of people look at the 9 grid image and the positioning of the vendors, and that obviously drives a certain amount of activity and interest in the market. But the key thing is to also understand is why we've looked at the market the way we have. So the trends, things like the market trends, solution trends, the bits behind the model, and Sven's obviously going to touch on this a little bit in a second, but that really provides a lot of insight around what we see really going on, and ultimately that impacts the way we will also rate the vendors. If vendors, everybody is innovating to some degree, but if they're not innovating in the areas that the market is most pulling towards, then potentially they might be falling behind still, and so on and things like this. So read the report. It gives you a lot more information also about what makes up the 9 grid, what the variables are, what it specifically means for cloud HR, what the inclusion is, etc., and stuff around it, but also, and as I said, what the trends are and how we weight them.
Thank you, David. So I'll take over from here. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you might be, or good evening. So I think if we look at the cloud HR market, I think we need to define what that one thing is that we're looking at, right? So obviously we've done that. We are looking at it basically from the HR process from A to Z, from everything from organization, people, core data that you need to maintain and manage, across skills, workforce management. So everything within people operations and people management, as we call it, into payroll. And then surrounding that is the talent and people success side of things, recruiting, learning, performance, and so on. Recently, there's also been a significant emphasis on the 4 additional pillars that we look at, which we call the enterprise context, which are integrations, intelligence, analytics, and employee experience. So those are things, obviously, that you find within all of the solutions in your ecosystem, but there's also an overarching element to it that transverses the ecosystem and also is important to integrate with the wider corporate ecosystem. So obviously different companies employ different strategies towards these kind of elements as well. But I think it's important to note that when we look at the Cloud HR 9-Grid, that this is the functional model that we are covering, and we are basically updating the functional model year over year. So this year in particular, obviously, there has been a continued focus on diving a little bit deeper into payroll, which is an area that interests us a little bit more nowadays. But also, certainly, we have added a lot of functional criteria around generative AI, and that allows us also to obviously help us compare vendors on those, bleeding edge new types of functionalities that get introduced basically as we speak. But it's not just one thing, right? So we have basically also published a paper quite recently around how we see HCM evolve, and we are talking a lot at Fosway about ecosystems. So the Cloud HR ecosystem is one where we feel that this is a particularly important notion to mention as well, because it's never just one system, right? It's always an ecosystem. You always have something in learning or the learning suite as an add-on potentially to your suite. So a lot of corporates have multiple solutions in place. And this fragmentation in their HR tech stack has been worse for European buyers, because in Europe, companies grow through acquisition more often than they do in the States. There's a more fragmentation on the payroll side of things. So obviously it's more difficult to consolidate in these areas. And also at the same time, the solutions have really converged at the core. So the functionalities in terms of the scope and the sophistication that the solution bring to the market are very similar nowadays. So the ecosystem is becoming the biggest differentiator. And what we have found actually in this research is that also corporates look at it differently and employ different architectures or strategies about what they put at the center of the ecosystem. So there's basically four strategies that the paper talks about. One is HCM-centered, trying to get it all into one, the classic approach, if you like. But then because of the fragmentation, a talent-centered view. So if you are a more knowledge-based worker type organization, you might emphasize things around talent management, talent and people success much more. And you might put a talent-centered suite at the center and leave maybe your payroll systems underneath untouched. So you basically have an umbrella above it that allows you to run global processes and talent and so on and so forth. The other strategy could be for obviously, more retail, more manufacturing, more logistics, healthcare type organizations where the operational workforce is much, much more the dominant driving factor for your business success. So there we find organizations taking a workforce-centered view where they are putting or emphasizing things like pay, like communication on the shop floor, potentially, or even scheduling, shift planning, shift swapping, which make a much greater impact to the workforce, the frontline workers. So this definitely is something that we are seeing where corporates are focusing their attention into these kind of different types of suites, if you like. And I guess on the next slide, we can probably talk about this on the 9-Grid level as well a little bit. I guess coming back to some of the trends that David mentioned, the cloud HR market has, despite the glooming recession that is starting in some countries more than others here in Europe, has done fairly well. Many of the vendors of the leading providers still grow at rates above 20%. Or close to that. So particularly, I think the larger, more present vendors have been able to benefit from this trend because they have more modules. Customers find it easier to adopt, to buy an additional add-on. The business cases are under scrutiny. companies have to run business cases for even smaller changes now. And so that, I think, makes it easier for these larger suite providers to actually benefit from the weaker economy. And also pressure to consolidate has risen. So the IT department is pushing harder to get cost savings. So I think a lot of that is what has helped some of the larger providers. And we do track suites and specialists here on the 9grid. So the suites are the circles and the specialists are the squares. And historically, we have already, for some years now, included workforce management specialists. So for example, UKG people operations here in strategic challenger, or workforce software in the same zone, or Quinix in core leader are examples of those kind of specialist solutions that focus on workforce management. And there have been some suites recently, or some vendors who have announced that they would also develop a full-fledged workforce management module. So this is probably in response to the trend that we've described, that I've just described on the slide before, which is this workforce-centered HCM, because those vendors are eating into the, don't know if that's the right word, into the pudding of the others. I guess so. Workforce management is really becoming the next battleground within HCM. And vendors like Workday and Oracle are obviously making significant investments. But at the same time, building out these functionalities for just one industry alone is, a significant undertaking. So don't underestimate, I guess, the effort that needs to go into that. So I think that will be interesting to see across like the next 2 or 3 years how that plays out. Other specialists we've included obviously are around people experience. So how do you optimize employee experience across the whole ecosystem? It is improving, but there are still some key concepts missing. Personalization is one of the ones that maybe hasn't been understood or hasn't been embraced by many corporates yet, despite some vendor noise in that area. So here, Microsoft Viva is included, ServiceNow as a specialist, NeoCase, Dovetail, who have an experience layer, but also some of the suite providers, of course, have certainly people experience functionality embedded into their suites. And I think, yeah, David, you mentioned HR Tech and Unleashed. I mean, from the whatever 50 odd conversations that I've had, there were only 2 where AI wasn't mentioned. So it's actually something that we're seeing, particularly generative AI is making inroads into the solutions. Next year, my expectation is that everybody has a co-pilot, has something in their solution baked in. It is a little bit slower than the hype suggests. So the corporates are certainly waiting for the vendors to make the first move, but are looking actually to adopt it. And many do expect quite a significant impact from it, particularly on productivity. So I think that is definitely something to focus on. David, maybe anything from your side to add to it?
No, I mean, I think the Gen AI thing is obviously the big wall of noise at the moment. I mean, we've both said now we've got to the point where we sort of count the minutes or seconds before the vendor brings it up in their briefing story. And I think we've said on other things that in some cases, it has completely superseded what they had, and they've almost binned sometimes what their strategy was before. In other cases, some of the vendors have got a more sophisticated view that I think is built on a lot of experience with things like machine learning and understanding how difficult it actually is to surface it sometimes in the solutions. But obviously that wave is still growing, not decreasing really from it. I think the other point that Sven, you've made in there, which I think is worth accentuating, is as we're seeing more focus around the specialisms being the disruptive part of the story within the wider HR ecosystem and HCM suite. Obviously, that also puts pressure on the big suite vendors to obviously up their game from an innovation point of view. And I think that's been visible really with the launches, the marketing story, the things from the vendors. But obviously, there's also a big challenge about bringing some of that innovation actually into customers. So sometimes the attach rate around that takes a while to build. And obviously for a lot of organizations, they're still implementing sometimes core functionality that it doesn't enable them to get to some of that stuff until later on in the cycle. But it's overall, I think it's still very vibrant marketplace. And probably the other factor probably always worth mentioning is how obviously the economic climate and the focus in companies on really, I would say, less about from an HR perspective around just a sort of employee experience narrative, and towards a much more kind of balanced view where, business performance, headcount reductions are on the hiring freezes in some cases, and effectively sort of real economics has reasserted itself, I think, in terms of a lot of companies and what they're trying to do, and that obviously is putting a lot of pressure on business as a result. So I think that's also then reflected into the HR side very significantly, and on some of the priorities, I think, for customers in deploying this stuff.
Thanks, David. Before we get into the Q&A about this 9-grid specifically, I've actually had a more general question, which I think is probably better directed at you than Sven, which is about differentiating between products from the same supplier. We're sort of going back to the explanation of the methodology of the 9-grid, but got a question from Ian about MHR People First being on there, but their primary product is iTrent. And so how do we differentiate between these things, I guess, is the question.
Aimed at me, sorry, John.
It is aimed at you, yes.
Yeah. So it's a good question. In some cases, we do have multiple solutions from the same company included. So UKG Ready and UKG People Operations is an example of that in some ways. Coming back specifically with MHR, when we our primary focus in looking at this is around cloud and cloud HR. So, and this 9-grid has evolved a bit. I mean, it was purely, we did call it Cloud HCM for a while before we then sort of decided that HCM was just part of the story we wanted to tell. I think the reality is when we look at some of solutions, within some companies, a lot of their, what I would call their legacy or main solution has typically been not necessarily a pure cloud solution. So in the case of MHR, we looked at People First really because it was their pure cloud solution rather than on-prem or hosted or whatever it was. So I think, where something emerges up as the next generation or it becomes a pure cloud offering, then, we will have seen examples in the past where we will have then started to focus more on that part of the portfolio. So maybe a good example of that in the past was Core HR, which has now become part of Access, obviously, Access People, having made the acquisition, where Core moved away from being largely an on-prem or hosted solution to become a cloud solution, and then ultimately into, through the acquisition to Access, to become a core part of the Access People portfolio. Sven, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it is maybe worth mentioning again that in the report, there's a table that actually lists out the solutions that we've been assessing. So in that table, you actually will find, if you have questions about a certain vendor, and there's certainly only so much space here on the grid, and there's obviously certain policies as to the names that we put on here and so on, how we do this. There's quite a bit of due diligence around that. But of course, then there's a table that shows the vendor names in the back of the report. So there you can actually see the solutions that has been assessed for a particular vendor. Like ADP, for example, obviously has a multitude of solutions as well. We assess IHCM, for example, and MHR People First is another example, and there's many more in that sense as well.
Thank you, Sven. Just coming back to an earlier point, Alexandra comments, I see ticketing companies where the HR part is just perhaps 10% of their businesses. So there are kind of crossovers here for sure. I've got a couple of questions. As it says on the slide here, this is the Ask the Analyst session. What would you like to know? Please do drop your comments into the chat, making sure it's ticked to everyone. And while people gather their comments together, I've got a question for you, Sven, about well, about consolidation, I think. Do you expect more from the 9 grid next year? If you can sort of get the crystal ball out, do you think this is the direction we're heading, or do you think that we will see fewer vendors on the grid, or perhaps they'll be replaced by more startups as specialists as the market diversifies?
Yeah, so money has become more expensive, right? So the wave where money was for free, I think, is now gone. Inflation has been high. Of course, this has an impact on, venture capital, private equity money, and so there's obviously been a lot of consolidation going on in the market in the previous years, and it has come probably a bit more to a slowdown over the past month because of the economy, because of the economic situation. So if we look at the future, there are obviously a few providers who have large providers as well who are backed by private equity or by other investment firms. So those might want to make a move. Obviously, we can't foresee of anything around this, but certainly we do obviously track specialisms in a way towards the other part of your question. So there's we always look at the specialisms as to how do they influence the main suite buying decision. So those specialisms that have an influence on that are the ones that we usually like to include. So here we have people experience, for example. We have global payroll now included as a specialism, and also workforce management. We've probably dropped one, which was around absence management, which got a bit more accentuated during COVID, but is maybe not as high on the priority list anymore. So it could well be possible that we see other vendors spark up in that sense next year. So I guess it's always possible that there will be more vendors, but ask me next year, really, I can't predict this for like that period. David, anything from your side, maybe?
No, I mean, I think there's always pressure on every 9grid, seemingly, for other companies that are candidates for inclusion in there. But we also recognize, there is a limit under which it becomes the model's useful in terms of representation. And so there's always kind of pressure for us to look at it and rationalize it, or potentially more, as Sven said, towards the parts of the story that we think are really driving. And this is the kind of thing I would emphasize when we talk to particularly larger organizations. What are the themes, and as well as who are the vendors that are really driving the narrative in those organizations? How is this changing? And obviously over time, that might mean we de-emphasize certain parts of the story as well. And that might include us rationalizing the vendorscape around that as well. We're not trying to include every vendor that is a candidate. But we are trying to include the majority of vendors that really are shaping the discussion in the types of organizations we're dealing with. So typically those European headquartered enterprise companies, large enterprises particularly. So.
Thanks, David. I remember a few weeks ago, Sven, I think you said to me that you don't like to predict the future. You more like to talk about analysing what's happening in the present and getting your crystal ball out. So apologies for that question. But so we've had two in, one from Nigel, one from Patrick. I'm going to take Patrick, yours first, because it's specific to this 9grid. And you're asking, Cloud HR is the name of the report. I'm interested in your view of HR workloads, I guess the percentage still on premise, the rate at which they're moving into the cloud, and which service providers your clients rely on for migration services. To you first, Sven, on that.
Yeah, so I think the battle between on-prem and cloud has been decided, I think. Towards the cloud, the proportion of companies still on-prem is obviously in some parts of Europe bigger than in others. Germany obviously has had a history of more on-prem systems. It's certainly still an interesting point for companies in public sector, potentially, where they maybe find a government cloud or a private cloud kind of hosting arrangement around that. where some providers actually have dedicated secure cloud offerings in the market for those kind of industries or sectors. In the defense industry, it's obviously particularly important. Also with the geopolitical disruption that we're seeing, it's actually not going to go away from these industries, I don't think necessarily. So certainly there is a bit of a residual that remains, but for the majority of European organizations, I think they have accepted that cloud is the model that they want to go to. So, and the economies of scale are certainly playing in favor of obviously the model, software as a service, where you get the releases. I think last year we spoke a lot about, in the report, a little bit about how some corporates had become over-dependent on their system implementers and weren't able to really make changes themselves. We've looked into that a little bit more. We also want to revisit this part, probably 2024, as part of our a part of strategic research around TCO. So how does that play out with low-code, no-code platforms, which provide additional opportunities to customize these systems, to build native apps, and so on. So I think there is certainly an ecosystem of providers that have done a good job managing those client relationships. But there's also a lot of companies, particularly in the mid-market, where they are more self-sufficient, who have really mastered cloud and are able to cope with all, the new releases, the quarterly updates, and are able to embed that and create the value from those releases for their internal organization. So I think that is actually a good story. In terms of the providers that they use, that was, I think, another part of the question. We see certainly there's larger system implementer players. I mean, I don't need to mention the names. They're probably well known in the industry, but also there are some boutique providers who are maybe more operating on a country or on a local level. And from that perspective, we've also found that some corporates have actually, for some specialized needs in certain modules or in certain areas of HR, prioritized working with some of the local providers who are more specialized in, say, recruitment or in learning or some other area. Whereas they would, for the the global rollout, the core HR implementation with all the the basics, they would trust usually one of the bigger providers. I hope that answers the question. If not, circle around please in the chat. Or David, if you want to add anything.
No, I think part of the question was, what's the workload and how much of that is still on-prem? And I think the other bit is, this is still clearly that we're in the journey, right? So for a lot of large organizations, some of them jumped early, some of them are jumping later, and it's taking a while. SAP particularly obviously came out with a strategy called hybrid, basically, which was not forcing their customers to jump straight into SuccessFactors and EC and things like this, and being able to kind of operate in a hybrid environment for longer. And there's lots of, you can argue what that's driven by, but at the end of the day, obviously it does perpetuate a situation where you have this hybrid on-prem and cloud model operating, etc. But the direction, the direction of flow is pretty clear. And it's also starting to impact other parts of the stack. So, for example, payroll is Sven picked up as an example where the strategy in the past has often been about not messing up payroll, I would say, in terms of the motive for innovation around it. But that has clearly started to change and accelerate, and changes within payroll, like day pay and so on and things like this, are accelerating that further. Now, that isn't an automatic slam dunk. It now has to be done in the cloud, but anything that has a pressure for innovation will almost naturally gravitate more towards the cloud faster, just because innovation is faster in that environment. So yeah, we're still in the journey. Some big companies have still only partially in cloud. Some have moved already. In the mid-market, it was typically easier for somebody to transition in one go. But obviously, it's also been in some ways less pressure in some ways for that You go back to, you know, one of the earlier questions where somebody has multiple options, a vendor has multiple options. Often, you know, especially a lot of customers have highly customized environments, then obviously transitioning those out becomes a lot more challenging. So, but there's one direction of travel.
Thanks, David. Questions coming thick and fast. Please do keep them coming. Sally, I think I could probably answer yours, which is a more general question about the 9 grids. It is a several months long process of gathering info, and research, interviews, everything. There'll be more about this a little bit later. Nigel, I'll pick yours up later, actually. And 2 from Juliet. The first being, is cloud payroll included in the assessment of vendors? There are some payroll elements there. I'll let you talk a bit more about this, Sven, in just a sec. And the second part of her question, to what degree are companies having to purchase add-ons to their HCM solutions to meet requirements? So the first part, Sven, about payroll.
Yeah, so cloud payroll is included in the analysis. We, for the first time, have included specialists on global payroll solutions. I think Niamo and Ramco were 2 examples, but there's also some suite providers who have a cloud, multi-country payroll offering. I don't think there is something that is truly global, but you know, certainly they can cover natively quite a few countries on a cloud engine. Also, ADP obviously has an offer. Cerillion has an offer. UKG has recently acquired a company doing that. So there's certainly an area where also from the corporate side we are seeing greater interest in consolidation in that landscape. So if not to 1, then at least getting down to 2 providers or maybe 3 globally is what a lot of companies are aspiring towards. So functionally, it is included. And the other question, John, again, was around...
Do they have to buy extra stuff?
Do they? Oh, yeah. So yes, a lot have to buy extra stuff. I think the tendency to buy extra stuff, if you want to call it like this, we call them disruptive specialists, I think. So these disruptive specialists you see more on the larger enterprise segment. The mid-market or the smaller enterprises obviously prefer to buy single suite still. And particularly in those segments of the market, I think the workforce-centric, talent-centric, and HCM-centric story is really, really important to think very well through what you put at the center. But certainly in the larger enterprise space, it is much easier to implement a specialist who can disrupt or improve one particular area where you are where you're struggling as an organization, or where you want to make improvements or drive value faster from these kind of specialism areas. And skills was an example. Like, we've seen a lot of innovation and disruption coming from that space over the past few years, but there were others as well. So yes, I mean, there are companies who have like tens, if not hundreds of solutions in their HR ecosystem, if they're a very large global company. And certainly they have implemented most of them for a good reason. They are now starting maybe to consolidate that a little bit more. So I would expect that from a corporate perspective, we will see some roadmap consolidation across the next 12, 18 months. But certainly there's still a lot of companies buying something extra to serve a specialized need.
I think the other thing, you already said this in one of the slides earlier, Sven, though, but so, you know, we always say to people, think ecosystem, not system. I think it's really important to do. Even if you have a HCM suite as an anchor solution around which you're building, the reality is both because of functional diversity within your organization, but also geographical, right? Because if you've got multiple businesses or business units, you make acquisitions, you sell off companies, etc., there's always additional. And that's, I think there was a point on the slide earlier which talks about European companies tend to be much more multinational very quickly than maybe a US centric organization. And actually what that means is they have a lot more geographical fragmentation, and that obviously then leads to fragmentation in systems and therefore ecosystem story. And that's where, for example, talent-centric came. We were dealing with lots of companies where basically there are different HR systems and different payroll systems in every country, but their only processes, global processes, strategic ones, from an HR point of view, were actually talent-related. So we started to think about this and go, well, actually, you don't need to like rip and replace the HR core in order to create that strategic HR overload. Let's think about that as a model, which is what led us towards the talent-centric story. So always that's the case. And I think the geo-fragmentation obviously is a magnifier effect on that. And whilst companies may well still have a focus, and obviously economically there's a strong pressure, and Sven referred to it, to consolidate. Basically IT wants less systems and reduce the number of integrations and so on. But at the same time, business performance drivers force companies to try and fix certain problems faster than they would do if they were able to, if they had to rip and replace everything and then go and start to address those challenges. So that's why, skills intelligence, talent intelligence is a really good example of that, where it's often been driven more by a specialist, and maybe at some point will then be pulled back into the suite afterwards. But I think that argument is nearly always true in nearly every company we deal with. It's just a question of how explicit it is within their strategy or not, or in some cases how much in denial of it they are within their strategy. Because you can have somebody that, at face value, this is what they say, but actually when you look at what's really going on, many of the disruptor investors, the transformational ones, are outside their core.
We do ask in our HR Realities survey, which is an annual survey, the question around where companies have standardized the HR systems. Core HR is 65% standardized across Europe. So, and this is quite constant across the past, actually 2, 3, 4 years. And I think from that perspective, there are still those other 35% who have a different strategy than maybe, having one core system in place, but multiple. So I think, and they do this successfully, right? So, and this is exactly what we mean with this rethinking HCM and the ecosystem and a talent-centric or a workforce-centric view, which is just acknowledging the reality for these kind of 35% of organizations in Europe.
Thank you, Sven. Coming back to payroll quickly.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, this is, as it says in the report, as it says in the report, this is an area of HR which has as yet resisted a lot of innovation and has been fairly staid for a long time. And now things like earned wage access are coming on stream for a lot of providers and things like that. What else do you think we're seeing within these specialists, these disruptive specialists as well?
Yeah, so I think payroll is certainly an area which probably in the last 40 years there was, the innovation was really more centered around staying compliant and making sure you had obviously made sure that you are, up to the latest legislation and such. But otherwise there was, fairly little innovation, and also corporates didn't really want to change much around it. With the pandemic, with now also the, the inflation and the greater pressure on incomes and available funds, some of the innovations, the recent innovations in payroll are actually becoming much more sought after by corporate clients. Real-time payroll, like, it's no longer a back office function where you have an HR or payroll administrator who sits, in their office or at home, doing all these kind of calculations and managing the process. And then you get this sheet of paper on your phone, or still in Germany on paper or whatever. It is now something where the employees have real-time access to it. So they can actually see the impact that the next shift makes on their earned income this month. And then with earned wage access, you can also provide employees with access to that money should they need it. And it's not something, it's certainly something which is probably more relevant for workforce-centric organizations, but certainly, anyone would be happy to draw down money, for the next holiday or whatever, if they could, right? There's no law that says you can only be paid at the end of the month, right? This doesn't exist. My grandfather got money in the bag, every week, obviously spend it in the pub or whatever, right? But so there's obviously, some governance you need to have around it. But certainly it is something like this kind of innovation where a few vendors have actually started to invest in that and come to market with products. They see adoption, particularly in the UK is where this has started. The other markets in Europe are not there yet, but vendors are also working on Germany and France and getting that into place. So I think it is an area from a corporate perspective, if you haven't looked at this space for some time, I think now is an opportunity to actually look at it, because it does provide some significant advantages on the employer value proposition, on the branding side of things. If you can attract operational workforce because your pay conditions are better, if you give them this earned salary access earlier, then I think it makes a huge difference. It can save you actually some money potentially. I guess just try not to make the employee pay for those deductions. So I think obviously that would be the recommendation. So this is, I think, one of the areas. Other areas of innovation in payroll quickly are really around managing it more on a global basis or on a multi-country basis. So having a cockpit view across all the different countries and kind of seeing where everybody is, the last mile problem. There's also some countries where maybe you have outsourced stuff or you're doing the payroll runs yourself with your own legal entity. So those kind of tools to manage this overarching process on a global basis are becoming much more prominent with corporate buyers now. So I think those are maybe two areas in payroll, if we talk about them. There's certainly also a link to obviously shift planning, earning opportunities, financial well-being is certainly also something that got accentuated significantly because of the economic situation. But David, I think you wanted to add something as well.
No, I was actually going to add about when you were talking about that global planning around things. So I think it's debatable for a lot of companies where the payroll was actually even an HR function, right? Or was it a finance function or living between the two somehow? And I think what's happening with the way that we're looking at pay as part of the process is it's becoming both being pulled closer to HR, but HR is being pulled closer to operations because of it, ultimately, right? The boundaries between those, and therefore anything that enables you to have a real-time, accurate view of cost in the business and to look at how you can optimize that cost, and the sort of, down to sort of workforce planning and optimization, even then tying back that across into recruiting and stuff sometimes, or a contingency worker, etc., and things like this. So in the past, these things have been very siloed. And although somebody will talk to you about having that view, the reality is they're trying to synthesize it from multiple sources, probably which are actually incompatible, and they weren't able to really have an accurate view, which is one of the reasons why, I think a lot of companies were driven to go and put in HCM actually originally, because effectively their chief HR officer disagreed about how many people they were employing with the chief finance officer, right? So effectively you're sitting there going, well, we need one view of the truth. And I think with the innovations around pay and then starting to look at it in a different way, and then tying that back a lot, obviously, into shift and workforce management and all of this coming together, the view that we actually have of what's going on inside the company and where we are spending money from a people perspective and potentially what we're getting back from it becomes a lot more both real time and, more importantly, accurate. And that's the bit that's been missing in the past. I think you can underestimate the value of that in an economy that is fundamentally being driven by, inflation, cost optimization, headcount optimization type agendas. It's very much of the time of what's going on in the economy.
David. Yes. Right at the very end of the report, there's you mentioned about people analytics, Sven. And the fact that they've probably got an opportunity to make a difference much more quickly than suites do. Because suites may not be so agile in that respect. I was wondering if you could just talk a bit more about that, because that seems like obviously an area of opportunity.
Yeah, not necessarily suites. So I think specialist providers actually are able to implement the solution faster. They come usually with an predefined model that allows companies to accelerate their view of analytics and make it easy to integrate into that view. So whenever and this is usually the case when companies take a more custom-built approach, they build their own kind of, Power BI dashboards or, whatever other tool they might be using, then certainly a lot of the time and effort they need to spend to consolidate the model, to kind of think about how the data is being connected into that takes a lot of time, usually years. And some of the specialist providers can accelerate that process very significantly, down to months. So I think that is certainly, from a time to value perspective, quite an interesting proposition. The other thing, though, then is, okay, you've now created, after 2 years, you've created this great dashboard. Then how do you give access to people, to managers in particular, to it? So usually it's not just the executive team that needs access to it, but it's the line managers. This could also be like 5,000 or whatever kind of people, right? In your organization, different departments and different geos, and they all have different access rights. So how do you manage that? So I think that is another year's project then to build on top of those non-specialized solutions, which take a very a domain agnostic view of the market. So second point, and the third point is probably around the benchmarking, the ability to benchmark your own data against your industry or peers or other parts of the market that you're interested in. So I think those are 3 elements why we've included this as a specialism for the first time this year, but certainly we will also dive a little bit deeper into that across the next years.
Unmuting myself there, rookie error. Yeah, I mean, there's so much more in the report that we could talk about. We've only got 4 or 5 minutes left. We could talk about total cost of ownership and low code, self-configurability. That stuff is really interesting as well, about kind of CHROs not being so reliant on CTOs and all that kind of thing. But I must ask Nigel's question, which was about the 9-grid itself, and a slightly more general question. He asked, within each of the 9 boxes, is there any significance in the placing of each vendor? It looks like there may be 9 positions per box. So David, I wanted to ask you that one first to give a good explanation of how it comes about.
How astute. Yes, exactly. So, I mean, basically the way we build the 9-grid, and this is really, really important to your interpretation of it as well. It's not linearly scored, although obviously when we do some of the underlying assessment activity, we are comparing relative to each other. What we actually do when we come to the end assessment is basically give the different dimensions of the 9-grid, so performance, potential, presence, TCO, etc., a high, medium, low rating, which is how we end up with the 9 boxes. And that high, medium, low is effectively looking at it relative to the whole market in terms of what we're doing. So it's a banded approach, not a linear scoring. When you come down to then look at trajectory, so within a zone, what we would say is those vendors are sort of materially equivalent in terms of their performance and potential rating. So they're typically serving similar customers and so on. And in reality, you can never say that one vendor is always better than somebody else. It's very dependent then on customer context and what's going on to understand what's going to be their most successful choice, which is why we see lots of companies use like vendor groupings from the zones in 9-grids, and that goes into their RFP process, right? Because they're looking at similar performing sometimes to vendors. The positional rating, the trajectory, which is effectively, is it right in the center of the zone? Is it or up or down or top right or top left? And there are 9 positions. And that is about their trajectory relative to themselves and the market as a whole. So if somebody is effectively performing and innovating at the same rate as the whole market, they will probably be in the middle of the box. when somebody is out innovating, maybe the wider market, and maybe has accelerated their own innovation, so they're effectively relative to themselves, they've also accelerated, then you'll see them go upwards. And similarly, if they are outperforming the wider market, so they're growing faster, or you've seen a big change sometimes in when the left to right rating can often be very impacted by customer advocacy. That in some ways is the trump card on all of this. Is if somebody can be growing very fast, but if they have bad customer advocacy, that will really pull them back in terms of their overall banding for it. But when you're looking at then somebody pushing right, you're saying there's a relative increase in their performance relative to themselves and the market as a whole. So the challenge sometimes we see is obviously vendors can end up in the same trajectory position, in other words, the same mini 9 boxes within each zone, because of slightly different reasons, because of what's going on with them. That doesn't mean they're exactly the same. It just means that their trajectory is changing relative to the market in the same way, but it could be driven by completely different factors. So that's quite complicated. The important thing for you to understand is the zone they appear in typically defines the companies that are more equivalent than the others, especially when you're looking at suites versus other suites. Obviously, specialists is slightly different. And then when you look at it within a zone, the trajectory is relative to themselves in the market. So if I'm looking at this like in strategic leader here, you know, what we've seen is actually a significant improvement in terms of from a customer advocacy and satisfaction for SAP. We know they've always been selling lots of success factors, but what we've seen actually is a relative improvement also in the customer satisfaction around that. That's what's led them to have an increased trajectory to the right hand side and so on. So the positional piece within there is not relative to the others, it's relative to themselves and market as a whole.
Thank you, David. Anything to add to that, Sven? Or I think David's
David explained it perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, so this is, I think we're coming to the end of the session, unfortunately, but we've covered quite a lot. Thank you so much, David and Sven, for your time. Remember that less than 50% of corporate buyers are happy with their HR and learning technology buying decisions. And as we mentioned before and have throughout this, the 9 grid is the result of many months of unique, in-depth research of vendors and customers carried out by our analysts. The engagement process uses our extensive solution data, decision tools, and unique analyst insights to cut the length of your vendor research process by 70%. You can read the full report. Jack's put it in the chat there, so do click on the link there. And don't forget about the Fosway corporate membership as well. It's an invite-only network for HR learning and talent leaders, giving you access to the data and insights that sit behind all the 9 grids, all the realities research. Plus you get automatic booking privileges for our roundtable program and plenty of other benefits as well. So yes, David and Sven, thank you so much for your time. There's a few more links on screen there for you to dig into as well. On to the next one. For now, have a great rest of the week and see you all next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good day.